Hello, everyone. Welcome to Murder Mindset. I'm your host, Deirdre, and here we don't just recount true crime, we dissect it through a neurological lens. For those of you guys watching on YouTube, I am going to be looking down a lot. So I'm going to be reading. We want to make sure that we're getting everything accurate. I will be posting pictures throughout the video of the victims, the people involved. And then for those of you that are listening, pictures will be on our Instagram or our TikTok at the Murder Mindset, so you can follow and go through everything. On this show, we ask the questions that most true crime coverage leaves out. What was happening inside the brain? What environmental forces were shaping it? And how does the nervous system collapse so completely that reality itself slips away? This isn't about excusing harm. It's about understanding the mechanisms that make it possible so we can see the whole story, not just the ending. I completed my graduate studies at Johns Hopkins, and I spent a lot of time studying how development, trauma, stress, grief, and the environment shapes the brain, and how those forces influence behavior and decision-making. A brain never breaks out of nowhere. It builds toward a breaking point, slowly, invisibly, and often in plain sight. Today, we're starting with the case of Andrea Yates, one of the most polarizing and misunderstood tragedies in American crime. People remember the outcome, but they rarely understand the process. The years of documented psychosis, repeated hospitalizations, inconsistent treatment, neurological unraveling, and the systemic failures that shaped the lead up to June 20th, 2001. If you think you know this case, you probably don't. At least not the medical collapse, the psychiatric warnings, or the way that her brain slowly lost its ability to tell fear from reality. This episode explores how that happened and how that could have been prevented. I do want to give a quick trigger warning before we get into anything. This episode includes discussion of postpartum psychosis, child death, delusions, psychiatric hospitalization, trauma, and severe mental illness. Listener discretion is advised. So before we talk about the case or the diagnosis or the medication changes, motherhood, religion, the day of the tragedy, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the nervous system that was shaped long before Andrea ever became a mother. Because her story doesn't just start with postpartum psychosis, it actually starts with childhood. Andrea Yates was born in 1964 in Houston, the youngest of 5 children in a tightly structured, emotionally restrained Catholic household. Her father was a quiet, hardworking man, and her mother was strict and practical, focused on keeping the home running rather than creating space for emotional expression. In families like this, especially for the youngest child, the safest place is often the smallest one. Andrea learned that staying quiet, agreeable, and perfectly behaved kept the environment calm. She adapted by becoming the child who never took up space, never disrupted, and never asked for more than what was offered. Growing up without room for emotional expression doesn't stop a child from having feelings. It actually teaches them to fold those feelings inward. Andrea's nervous system adapted by internalizing everything and reaching outward for nothing, creating an outer appearance of capability while leaving her increasingly vulnerable beneath the surface. This pattern followed her into adolescence, where she continued to excel. She was the valedictorian of her high school, captain of her swim team. She was a high-achieving student who appeared disciplined and composed. Teachers and friends made remarks that she was constantly excelling. She was doing well, and honestly, this kind of person looks really, really put together. But perfectionism doesn't actually strengthen the brain. It conceals fragility. Andrea's sense of worth became tied to performance, control, and compliance, and the pressure to maintain that image deepened the self-silencing that she had learned as a child. Obviously, not everyone that grows up in an environment like this or a household like this is internalizing things, but it is very, very common. And when we break down this case and kind of go back into everything, we are going to see that. So it is really important to understand her background, where she came from, and how she developed the mechanisms that we're later going to talk about throughout this case. After high school, Andrea attended the University of Houston, where she studied nursing. Even there, she maintained the same quiet, high-achieving persona. She was independent, she was disciplined, and there she was deeply self-contained. She appeared capable and focused with little indication of internal strain that she carried. Her identity was built on holding everything together or never showing distress, and on excelling no matter what the cost. And a nervous system that's actually shaped this way can perform well for many years. However, it does become increasingly rigid and less able to tolerate stress. And if you think about it, college is the time where you are exploring, you're learning, you're doing things for the first time, and this is kind of where you're breaking out of your box. And this is where we're building and learning that tolerance that will take us into adulthood. And it was noted that she didn't party, she didn't go out, she didn't really have any of that. She went to school, did her thing, did well. It was also noted that she, although she had friends, her social life wasn't at the top of her college career like many people's are. She also was noted to not have a relationship either. So it was just kind of like going through college, getting her degree, and to the outside, that looks like a perfect student, right? Like you have your life together. But again, this is going to paint a really big picture later on. After college, she became a registered nurse at MD Anderson Cancer Center. And this is one of the most emotionally demanding clinical environments imaginable. She works with patients facing terminal diagnosis. She absorbed their fear, their grief, their uncertainty. There's no evidence that she processed that emotional weight outwardly or relied on others for support. And that's a that documented her pattern of internalization. So carrying stress privately, quietly, and without the protective release that comes from expressing distress or seeking help. I feel like nowadays we know like nursing school, medical school, PA school, it's so challenging. And a lot of people get through that by relying on their support system. Can you get through these rigorous programs without a support system? Yes. Are you going to struggle? Yes. It is known that while she went through nursing school and through this career, she didn't really talk about that. Like she didn't have that help. And I just can't imagine, especially after my graduate studies. I mean, I had a couple breakdowns here and there. I actually had a point in my graduate studies where I was like, I don't think I'm going to do this, like forget this degree. So I just can't imagine kind of going through that without that circle social, but it really paints that picture that throughout her adulthood and her developed brain that she just really internalized a lot. So during her adulthood, as she was finishing nursing school, she crossed paths with Russell, known as Rusty Yates. Rusty was originally from Mississippi and he attended Auburn University, much of his identity around discipline, structure, and logic. He later worked as an engineer for NASA, which is a career that suited his temperament really well. He approached life like a series of solvable problems. If something was hard, you pushed through it, and if something was uncertain, you found order. So emotions for him were things that you managed privately and not rationally. And I think that this is really interesting because we know that her coping style was very, very different. She spent her life staying quiet, agreeable, self-contained, relied on perfectionism. I see seeing her calmness as stability, but she used calmness to keep herself safe. And these two weren't opposites. They were just totally shaped by very different emotional histories and how they express their emotions. When we look at relationships and we know that communication is key, we also really sometimes fail to highlight that emotional communication is key. So we're going to see this a lot later throughout this case, but I really just want to emphasize and highlight this. When Andrea is struggling, she doesn't talk about it. We're going to see that. And to him, because she's not talking about it, he thinks that everything is okay. So we know that they also had both grown up in religious environments, and like many young adults in their 20s, they were searching for meaning, identity, and direction. They shared a need for structure and purpose, and that really bonded them. Later, they encountered the teachings of Michael Warrenecki, who was a traveling street preacher who preached intensely about sin, obedience, and the dangers of modern comfort. His message resonated with each of them in very different ways. So for Rusty, whose worldview had already leaned toward discipline and clear principles, Warrenecki's teachings felt motivating and spiritually clarifying. But Andrea processed these teachings. It's hard to know for certainty, but we do know that records suggest that she took them very seriously and literally. So we don't see that she's debating or challenging or openly questioning them. We do know that she is someone that internalized expectations quietly and rarely voiced discomfort or doubt. So that pattern, not of blind compliance, but of emotional restraint, shaped how she navigated their evolving fate and lifestyle choices during the stage of her life. And I also do want to highlight just a quick interjection. I had posted on Twitter to kind of, or I'm sorry, I put Twitter. I haven't heard of Twitter in years. I posted on, how old am I? Wow. I posted on TikTok to advertise and do a little trailer for this episode, and a lot of you guys, first of all, I got such overwhelming support. So thank you if you're here from the TikTok, go ahead and drop a comment. But a lot of you had misconceptions that I am going to indirectly address throughout the case. But there was a huge misconception that Rusty had kind of forced her into this religious practice and she didn't have the say on her own. And I do want to say that it was documented that she did grow up in a religious household. And when they found Warnecki's teachings, she did absorb them. She did enjoy them. They both became close to the Warnecki family. She was even close to the Warnecki's wife. They would write letters back and forth. She even sent money to kind of help fund their mission. So she wasn't forced into this. This was a lifestyle that she found and it resonated with her in her life at that time. So next I want to go into, and this is a really important neuroscience psychology part of this episode that I think is really, really important to note. People rarely realize how deeply the ideas that we absorb in our 20s imprint on us, especially when those ideas are tied to identity, morality, or fear. The beliefs that Andrea and Rusty encountered during this period didn't become significant because they were extreme. Like, yes, in a way they did, but they really became significant because they lived at the intersection of structure, guilt, responsibility, and purpose, which concepts both of these people were very already sensitive to in different ways. So clinically, when psychosis later enters the picture, it doesn't create a brand new theme out of nowhere. The mind pulls from what is familiar, emotionally charged, and already woven into a person's world. So when we're looking at psychosis and delusions grow out of material that the brain already has. So the reason Andrea's future delusions took on a religious tone wasn't because someone, like I said, forced those ideas on her, but it's because they were already present in her environment and carried emotional weight long before her illness emerged. So I just wanted to flag this so when we're getting further into the case, we can have this on the back of our mind. Mind destabilizes. It didn't invent something that was new. It actually distorted what was already there. So in simple terms, psychosis doesn't invent new beliefs. It twists ones that you already had. So if religion is part of your world, your psychosis might become religious. If it's guilt that's familiar to you, your delusions might center on guilt. If fear is part of your daily life, psychosis might turn everything into danger. So the brain doesn't make a new story. It warps the story that you already know, which I think is really, really interesting and something a lot of people don't understand. So her and Rusty married in 1993, and after they married, they settled into a quiet, orderly life together in Houston. They shared the same values, which was discipline, structure, purpose, and faith, and their personalities fit together in a way that felt very easy. Andrea was soft-spoken, diligent, and intensely private, and Rusty was analytical, logical, and grounded in routine. So from the outside, everything looks calm and steady. And it's interesting, too, because when I did a lot of research and got into this case, I didn't have much information until I sat down and found this to start the podcast. But going through it, I was like, wow, these two people seem very well put together. I'm in my late 20s, and I think a common theme that I hear between my friends and myself and my internal dialogue and just like the world around us with social media is it's like, the person next to us has their life put together. Their relationship looks great and this and that. And we're always kind of chasing that and trying to achieve that. And it's really interesting when you dissect a case like that because that's what we're seeing from the outside. But on the inside, there's a lot more going on that even the individual might not understand. So when you're bringing that and you're putting that in a unit together, it becomes very interesting when you're trying to understand yourself and then trying to understand your partner and then trying to understand your relationship. So there's a lot of factors in play that are leading up to this case and that I think are really important to consider. As Andrea and Rusty began planning for children, neither of them had any reason to suspect how demanding that transition would become. They believed deeply in family and purpose and building a life rooted in faith and responsibility. But the pace at which their family would eventually grow and the intense physical and emotional demands of early motherhood would collide with Andrea's lifelong habit of silent endurance. And once the pressure began to build, it set the stage for a level of strain her nervous system had quite literally never been exposed to before. As the Yates family grew through the late 1990s, their living situation also changed in ways that added new layers of strain to Andrea's already taxed nervous system. During this period, Rusty made the choice, shaped by spiritual ideals that they had both embraced, to move the family into a converted Greyhound bus. The intention behind this move, and again, this is really based on the religious teachings, is simplicity, discipline, and a life free from what they saw as unnecessary comfort, because that was what was bringing them closer to God. So obviously, he's working as an engineer. She was a nurse. When they start, building their family, she stops working as a nurse, and he's, the full-time breadwinner of the family. And they decide, we don't need all this material stuff. Obviously, they can afford it. Like, they're in a very good place, especially with having children, and, she can step back from work. They just decide, this is what is religiously, like, we have family, we have faith, we don't need material items. And we hear about that a lot today in modern, times, simplicity, minimalist living. And that is great. Like, that can be a great lifestyle for a lot of people. But I think when you bring into, children and new children and babies, that's when it becomes a lot. And I think that that can be really misunderstood in a lot of cases. So again, I just kind of want to paint a neutral picture that this intention was a shared intention. And I think they were both going in a way that they saw fit at the time. And we do see that in documentation. She was like, we move into this bus. It does become overwhelming at times, but we both were on the same path when we had went into it, thinking that it would be the best move for our faith and our life and the lives that we want to live. So I also do want to just really quickly, because I think I glossed over it, get into the details of her children. So Andrea gave birth to her first child, Noah Jacob Yates, February 26th, 1994. Her second child, John Samuel Yates, December 15th, 1995. Paul Abraham Yates, her third child, September 13th, 1997. Her fourth son, Luke David Yates, February 15th, 1999. And their last and fifth child, who is their first daughter, Mary Deborah Yates, November 30th, 2000. So just kind of want to put that in there so we know the timeline of the births. At this point, they're living on the bus. I think at this point, they only had 3 children, and then she gives birth to her fourth child as they're living on this Greyhound bus. Andrea became pregnant with her fourth child, Luke. Her body and brain had been under continuous strain for almost 5 years back to back. So think pregnancy, delivery, hormone crashes, and chronic sleep disruption literally came one after another without pause. The coping strategies that she had relied on her entire life, like staying quiet, composed, pushing through, were no longer enough to hold her. In June 1999, which was roughly 4 months after Luke's birth, the collapse became impossible to ignore. One day, Rusty came home from work and he found Andrea sitting on the floor of their small trailer, knees pulled in, unresponsive, staring ahead as if she could no longer register her surroundings. Her fingertips were raw from chewing, which is a sign of obviously external and extreme internal distress. She wasn't speaking, she wasn't moving, she wasn't reacting, and this wasn't ordinary exhaustion. This is a term called catatonia, a neurological shutdown that occurs when the brain becomes so overwhelmed that basic function begins to disconnect. Speech fades, movement slow, regulation collapses, and the brain enters emergency mode. So less than 24 hours after that, Andrea attempted to end her life. And at this point, it was clear that she was no longer experiencing postpartum depression. She was in the midst of postpartum psychosis. So I want to pause really quick and do just like a quick breakdown on why postpartum psychosis happens, because again, I think this is a point that a lot of people confuse. It's basically 3 things happening at the same time. So we have hormonal crash, fast hormonal crash. You stop sleeping, your brain is overwhelmed. So to kind of get more into that, right after birth, your hormones drop harder and faster than at any other time in your life. And that alone, just that on of itself, can destabilize mood and thinking. But then you have a newborn, so you stop sleeping, and newborn sleep is very broken, unpredictable, and exhausting, and lack of sleep can make any brain foggy, but in extreme cases, it can trigger confusion, paranoia, or hallucinations. And when your brain is already overwhelmed, so if someone's already stressed, isolated, anxious, or stretched thin, as a lot of people are with a newborn, your nervous system has less capacity to bounce back. So when all 3 hit at once, we have the hormone crash, no sleep, and an overwhelm, the brain literally cannot regulate reality the way that it normally does. And that's when postpartum psychosis can happen. Postpartum psychosis is rare, but it can happen to anyone, even with people that do not have a history of mental illness. But there are groups that are at a higher risk for it. So we do know that people with a personal or family history of mood disorders, people who had postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety before, because your brain does become more vulnerable with each episode. We also know that people who are severely sleep deprived are at a higher risk for developing this. People that are under intense stress, isolation, or overwhelmed. And then another big one is people who stop or change psychiatric medications suddenly after birth or even during pregnancy. And there's a huge misconception on that. Obviously, I'm not a doctor and I'm not here to give any medical advice, but there's a lot of debates. And I can, if you're watching on YouTube, I'll put in some published articles. There's sometimes people think, I get pregnant, let me stop taking an SSRI or, a medication that I'm taking for a psychiatric disorder. And if you do that suddenly, because people think it's helping the baby and they don't have that right medical guidance, it can cause a lot of harm and cause something like this to happen. And then the other thing that makes this risk really high is people who have had postpartum psychosis before. The relapse rate is actually really high and more intense the second time, unfortunately. It's not a character flaw. It's not weakness. It is a literal medical emergency that can happen when biology and stress collide. And even the most loving, stable, responsible mothers can experience it. So that's why I think this conversation on postpartum psychosis, postpartum mental health, maternal mental health is literally so important. I studied this extensively at Johns Hopkins and my jaw dropped with how much that I had learned that I didn't already know. And I came into this program with a very medically inclined background. My mom's a nurse as well. And I had known a lot, but I learned so much more. And the key takeaway that I found from that was I felt that it was so devastating that this isn't common knowledge, because a lot of new parents don't have these resources. They don't have this understanding. They don't have this wherewithal. And this isn't just, after pregnancy. We see a lot of these chemical changes in the brain during pregnancy, especially in that first trimester. And I feel very passionate about this. I feel like it should be advocated more, and we're going to get a little bit into this case more. But yeah, really interesting stuff. So after Andrea's 1999 suicide attempt, she was hospitalized and started on Halidol, which is a high-potency antipsychotic used to treat severe psychosis. The turnover was fast and dramatic. So within 48 hours from taking this medication, she was talking, she was eating, and she was recognizing her own children again. But this was not emotional recovery. It was neurochemical stabilization. So Halidol works by blocking dopamine receptors, stopping the brain from attaching false meaning to ordinary thoughts and sensations. So when dopamine quiets, delusions fade, and reality comes back to focus. And her improvement just showed how treatable her condition was, but also how fragile her stability was as well. So fragility was really highlighted without proper medication. And here's one of the biggest misconceptions that live with regard to this case, and I did see a lot of these comments on the TikTok. People often assume that Rusty forced her off of her medication or that religion made her stop, and that actually isn't what happened. We will talk a little bit later about their beliefs with religion with regard to birth control. But for her psychiatric medication, totally different story. The decision to have her stop or change medications actually came from a misunderstanding of her illness. So Andrea looked better. And when someone starts to appear stable, the side effects of Halidol or whatever medication they're put on become more alarming than the issue that they had originally presented with. And so for Halidol, those side effects were stiffness, sedation, and flat effect. And that started to seem like her greater problem. So doctors and family misread her conditions as depression or general stress, not active psychosis. So they're saying she's no longer in active psychosis. She's depressed. We need to treat the depression. I don't think that the psychosis was the issue all along. And I don't know, this is medical miscite. There's a lot of factors in the play. And I think, again, we have to remember this happened late 90s, early 2000s. And medicine is evolving every day, especially when it comes to the brain, especially when it comes to understanding the brain and mental health. So there's obviously a lot of nuances since this case, and we can hope and assume and see that things would be treated differently. At the time, this is how this was taken. They looked at her, they thought that she was stable, so they put her on a different medication. And her antipsychotic was tapered and replaced with antidepressants. And that's a choice that's safe for depression, but it's very dangerous with someone that has a history of delusions. So antipsychotics control dopamine, and antidepressants increase mental activation before they restore clarity. So in a vulnerable brain, that combination can reignite psychosis. Andrea didn't stop taking her medication because she wanted to or because anyone forced her. It's literally because her stability was overestimated and the wrong diagnosis led to the wrong treatment. And I just have to stop and highlight right here because this is a huge thing we see in mental health. This is a huge thing that we see in medication. Stability is overestimated, mind blowing how a lot of this stuff is preventable. It is our system. Obviously, medicine really does need to develop in a lot of ways. It's crazy if you think about it, and I could chat about this for hours. We have such advanced technology when it comes to, we could talk about, cardiac, heart transplants, liver, dermatology, things like that. But when it comes to the brain, because it's so hard to understand, we don't. And a lot of times we see, people will say, oftentimes people will go to a PCP, their primary care provider, when they're dealing with mental health, and a primary care provider is not, and they are not specialized in understanding the brain. So sometimes they'll put people on very popular, medications, and then they realize, oh, this is the wrong medication, let's change it. And when you are testing out medications and you're going through that 4-week period of trying something new, coming off of it, you have a withdrawal, and then trying something else new, your brain is so destabilized. So I'm just saying this for a general person, not someone who's having back-to-back-to-back pregnancies. I know that there's some psychiatrists out there and psychologists who do brain scans where they try to kind of see, what is that chemical instability? Is it dopamine? Like, what is going on? What is a good medication, as opposed to doing a trial run error? So that's what we're seeing in this case. There's a lot of trial run. We know that her medications were changed. We know that there was a lot of misinformation, and there was a lot of key warnings missed. And again, this could have been, the time, what they had with medicine at the time. It's very disheartening, because when you put this case all out on paper, especially now in 2025, you're like, how could something like this happen when all the signs were there? But again, I would like to think, and we do have to look at that case in this lens, that they were doing the best that they could with the knowledge that they had at the time. So once they stopped the Haldol, they started the antidepressants. Andrea's decline didn't look explosive from the outside. It slipped in very quietly. The pacing came back, and then the whispering, and then the blank, frightening look that she would get when she would try to explain something. She stopped sleeping. She stopped engaging. She was unraveling slowly, but clinically it was obvious. Her psychosis was returning. In March 2001, her father died, and that loss sent her already fragile nervous system into a tailspin. Her father was one of the few emotional anchors that she had already had, and losing him wasn't just heartbreaking, it was neurologically destabilizing. We know that grief alone disrupts sleep, it spikes cortisol, and it overloads an already stressed brain. And with someone that has a history of postpartum psychosis, this is actually often the event that pushes the mind past the point of compensation. Her behavior after his death became unmistakably severe. She stopped eating, she stared for long stretches of time, she froze mid-step, she pulled out a lot of her hair, she would fill the bathtub with water for no reason. And these are the exact red flags that psychiatrists are trained to respond to. And a lot of this is clinically documented. This is a lot of the stuff that she was experiencing. Her clinicians did write warnings, very clear ones. She was seeing a psychiatrist called Eileen Starbranch, and she documented, quote unquote, that Andrea was a high risk for rapid relapse, psychotically depressed, in need of strict antipsychotic adherence, and should avoid further pregnancy due to psychiatric instability. Another clinician stated that she required 24 supervision at home and consistent medication management, as well as sleep protection and immediate inpatient care if symptoms return. Weren't general suggestions. These were red flag alerts. These were documented. These were in her medical profile. And these warning signs never solidified into a coordinated plan, because she would be admitted briefly stabilized slightly, and then discharged home, even though she was still delusional, sleep deprived, and still not on the antipsychotic that had saved her months earlier. So it wasn't that her husband, I saw there was like a lot of confusion about this. Like he was trying to pull her out of the doctors and she didn't want to go. It was literally she would be in care. There was one note saying she was there for 8 days. She was there for 12 days. She seemed normal. And remember, this is someone that internalizes. So she's quiet. The person next to her might be going through the same thing and outwardly displaying symptoms. The way that her brain processed from childhood into adulthood was, I'm stressed out, I'm overwhelmed, I need to be quiet and I need to keep this inside. So clinicians were like, oh, she looks composed. Like she doesn't look like the textbook person that's going through psychosis. I think she's fine. Let's send her home. So that's where that happened. And that's how that happened. Very unfortunate. So by June 18th, she was in the state that psychiatrists called fluoride psychosis, which means she no longer had the ability to separate intrusive thoughts from reality. Fear felt like fact, guilt felt like fate, and every delusion idea felt like a command to her. 2 days later, on the morning of June 20th, that untreated escalating psychosis reached its final catastrophic breaking point. On the morning of June 20th, Andrea should not have been left alone with her children. Rusty went to work, and his mother, Dora Yates, was scheduled to arrive and watch the kids because everyone in the family knew that she couldn't be alone. He left an hour before the mother arrived, and I do want to highlight again, he thought she's stable. She has been discharged from the hospital. She's struggling, but she's doing better. I think it will be okay for me to leave for an hour. And I don't say this to excuse him or to soften what happened. I just say this because I think it's really important to understand, what happened with that mental treatment. And we see this a lot in today's day and age. Someone looks stable and they're not. And that's why I think the conversation of mental health and mental health care and mental health treatment is so, so important, because that's how these flags can go, these red blaring flags can go miss. So he ends up leaving knowing the mother's going to be there an hour. He thinks everything is fine. Once he left, according to clinical documentation, Andrea moved with a calm, organized focus that came not from clarity, but from her untreated fluoride psychosis. She went to the bathroom and filled it up, and she started to drown her 3-year-old son, Paul, in the bathtub. Then she brought in 2-year-old Luke and 5-year-old John. She drowned each one of them separately and afterwards carried them to the master bedroom and laid their bodies on the bed with a chilling ritual-like detachment. This wasn't emotional coldness. It was a flat, mechanical behavior of a brain executing a delusional solution that it believed was necessary. She then brought in 6-month-old Mary and drowned her as well, placing the infant beside her brothers. And then this left only Noah, the last child, who was 7 years old at the time. He had actually walked toward the bathroom and saw Mary's body, and he understood instantly that something terrible was happening. And it's noted that he ran away. Andrea later told psychiatrists that even though he ran, she chased him back. And when she did attempt to start drowning him, obviously he's, bigger, he's older, he fought. And it does show there is signs of bruising on the other children, that they did fight to the best of their ability, but, they're little, they're young. He had a moment where he came up from the water and said, "I'm so sorry," and, indicating that he was in trouble. So when the sequence was over, Andrea called 911 in a voice that sounded disturbingly calm. People often mistake that for coldness, but clinically it was actually classified as the blunted effect, which is the emotional flatness that happens when the prefrontal cortex and the limbic system are no longer functioning normally. She then called Rusty and told him that you need to come home. This wasn't a moment of anger. It was not a spontaneous act. It was the result of a collapsing brain, mismanaged treatment, and ignored medical warning signs, and a vulnerable woman left unsupervised when she should have never been alone. So when she called 911, the dispatchers came. They noted that she was wet. When they went into the house, there was 2 sets of footprints showing that one or more of the children had tried to escape the bathtub. She was very calm. She was relaxed. She spoke to the officers. One of the sergeants noted that she came off as normal. I mean, he didn't know her history. He didn't know anything of that. So she seemed normal, but very strange for a mother who had just committed such a horrific act. When they had asked her why she had done this, she said, quote unquote, "I was saving them." And it wasn't a metaphor to be dramatic. It was her literal, genuine belief. And here's where neuroscience matters. A psychotic brain cannot evaluate reality correctly. So its dopamine salient system, which is the part responsible for deciding what thoughts are important, misfires. Thoughts that should be dismissed register as warnings, commands, or moral obligations. So anyone else, that could be an intrusive thought. To her, it was a command, like the sky is blue, you need to do this. And again, this isn't excuses. This is just the symptoms of a brain completely detached from reality. 1 week later, the Clear Lake Church of Christ filled with mourners for the funeral of Noah, John, Paul, Luke, and baby Mary. 5 small white caskets were arranged in a semicircle at the front of the sanctuary, each draped with flowers, each bearing the name of the child whose life had been cut short. When Rusty spoke, his voice broke as he moved from casket to casket, remembering each child. He said that 7-year-old Noah was intelligent, independent, and a little scientist who loved bugs. He described 5-year-old John as rough and tumble with the best smile, always happiest when he was with his brothers. He said that 3-year-old Paul was perfect. They called him Perfect Paul, and that he was the best boy. He said that 2-year-old Luke was a little bulldozer of the family and that he was full of energy and mischief. And when he reached 6-month-old Mary's casket, the smallest of them all, he placed her blanket inside and whispered, "I am so sorry that I did not get to see you grow up." At the graveside, he touched each casket, and as it was lowered, he repeated softly, "The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away," and that's exactly what he's done. It was a moment of staggering grief. 5 children buried together, a mother in custody, and a family shattered by an illness that no one acted fast enough to stop. Forensic psychiatrists who examined her shortly after found active delusions, hallucinations, catonic features, paranoia, religious preoccupation, and severe thought disorder. One doctor described her as, quote unquote, profoundly disconnected from reality, and another note believed that the killings of her children were the only way to save them from damnation. Every single mental health professional who evaluated her agreed that she was psychotic at the time of killings, but the prosecution pushed a different narrative, arguing that she knew right from wrong because she was able to call 911, she placed the children on the bed, and she locked the door. And the problem here is that these actions don't prove sanity because people in psychosis can dial numbers, answer questions, and follow basic sequences. What they cannot do, though, is attach correct emotional meaning to their actions or really understand the consequences. So the DA framed her behavior as intentional, but the science framed her behavior as delusional. And then throughout the case, during the first trial, a prosecution expert, Dr. Park Dietz, testified that Andrea had seen an episode of Law and Order in which a woman did the exact same thing, drowned her children in the bathroom, and got away by pleading insanity. And he claimed that she copied the plot. So when they were deliberating, they did find her guilty. They sent her to jail and put her on death row. She was in jail for 5 years. During that time, they found out that episode actually never existed. It wasn't real. It never aired. And they had to overturn the trial because a lot of jurors said that was like the turning point for them to be like, oh, she's copying this. She's totally guilty. So they actually did a retrial in 2006. And at this time, jurors were given the real psychiatric evidence, her medical history, her delusions, her hospitalizations, the warnings in her chart, and the severity. During the 2006 retrial, jurors were given the real psychiatric evidence, her medical history, her delusions, her hospitalizations, the warnings in her chart, and the severity of her postpartum psychosis. They heard from psychiatrists who explained that Andrea was not acting out of anger or revenge or malice, but she was acting under a fixed delusional belief that she had to kill her children to save them. So once they redid the retrial, they found out that she was not guilty by reason of insanity, and then she was transferred to Kerrville State Hospital, which is where she remains today. It is noted that she's doing much better. She's calm. She's out of psychosis, but she has realized, the gravity of what she's done. And I think, personal opinion, it's so heartbreaking when someone comes out of something like that and they realize what they had done. It's almost like you're looking at someone else's actions completely. She refuses to attend any hearings that could lead to her release because they do hearings yearly. She doesn't want to be let out. She feels that she doesn't deserve freedom and she should stay, quote unquote, where people are safe. So she has at a place where she, obviously she can't take back or change anything that she's done, but I think it is really notable that she refuses to go or have any hearing that would allow her to be an early release. For those of you watching on YouTube, my camera just died, so we're going to finish this off, no video. So we know that her surviving family doesn't visit her. We see that relatives have talked about her and who she was before this happened, but they don't really stay in contact with her. And Rusty Yates, he did file for divorce early during her jail sentencing. He did remarry. He had another son, and then that marriage later ended in divorce. He has actually spoken out about forgiveness and faith and the belief that Andrea should have never been left alone with the children that morning. And he also admitted that he underestimates the severity of her illness, which is something that remains one of the most debated aspects of the case. He maintains that she loved her children deeply and that the tragedy was the result of an untreated psychiatric illness, not malice. He does still visit her occasionally, but not regularly, and he does continue to advocate for better postpartum mental health awareness. This case is not just a tragedy. It is a map of what happens when a brain in crisis goes unseen by the people that were meant to intervene. Andrea Yates did not wake up one day and suddenly become violent. Her collapse was documented, warned about, predicted, and medically understood. Every single major red flag of postpartum psychosis, delusions, intrusive fear, sleep deprivation, rapid deterioration after pregnancy, loss of insight was present long before the day her children died, and the support she needed never arrived in time. Understanding this does not soften or excuse what happened. It does not change the outcome. It does not bring Noah, John, Paul, Luke, or Mary back, but it does force us to confront the reality that postpartum psychosis is not rare. It's not mysterious, and it's not about moral failing. It's a psychiatric emergency. It is treatable. It is recognizable, but when it's ignored, it can be deadly. Andrea's story is the story of a brain pushed beyond its capacity, a brain overwhelmed by hormonal collapse, untreated psychosis, and delusional fear, and a system too slow and too fragmented to stop the spiral. This is why we tell these stories. This is why neuroscience matters and why explaining the mind is never an excuse, but it is a responsibility. If this episode helped you to understand postpartum psychosis more clearly, or if it changed how you think about violence, mental illness, and systems that fail the people they're supposed to protect, we would love your support. Subscribe to The Murder Mindset, follow us on your platform of choice, and leave a rating or review. It helps more listeners find our work and allows us to keep bringing you deeply researched neuroscience-driven episodes like this one. This has been Murder Mindset. I'm Deirdre, and we will see you next week with another case where we take you throughout the brain.